Right now, your body is actively battling an invisible
It
invasion.
really is.
Like the device you are listening to this on, or maybe the one just resting in your pocket, it's actively altering the physical cellular structure of your brain.
Yeah, your brain, your eyes, and if you happen to be one of the millions who use electronic vaporizers, definitely your lungs too.
Exactly. And we aren't dealing with vague theories today on this deep dive. We are looking at the hard biological cost of our most common modern conveniences.
Right, because it's a profound shift in how we need to view our daily environment. The stack of research we're examining today, I mean, it literally spans the globe.
We've got longitudinal psychological studies from South Korea and Lebanon.
Yeah, and 9-year pediatric neurology reports out of Singapore,
Huh?
plus these incredibly dense chemical analyses of nicotine extraction from Russian customs data.
Which is wild, by the way.
It's totally wild. And we also have in vitro cellular toxicity reports from San Diego and Adelaide. So, it's a massive, diverse set of data.
But it all points relentlessly toward a single, unified mechanism of action.
It does.
And our mission today is to decode that mechanism for you. We're going straight into the wetware.
The wetware, right, the actual biology.
Yeah, we want to uncover the exact pathways, like the chemical compounds, the light frequencies, the specific neural loops that these handheld devices use to rewire human biology.
And by the end of this deep dive, you're going to understand that glowing screen on your desk and the sweet-smelling vapor cloud at the bus stop in a radically different way.
A highly illuminated way.
Definitely. But I think we should establish our analytical baseline immediately here.
Good idea.
We're looking at peer-reviewed science today. Not science fiction, and certainly not moral panic.
Right, we aren't here to fearmonger.
Exactly. We're here to map out the physiological and psychological reality. Because, when you understand the underlying mechanics of how a technology interacts with your biochemistry,
You strip away the marketing.
yes, you strip it away
Yeah.
and you regain the biological autonomy to make fully informed decisions.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want to start with the behavioral software before we even get into the cellular hardware.
Sounds good.
Let's look at the smartphone. And let's just skip the part where we pretend we don't know what a smartphone is or how ubiquitous it is.
Right, we all know.
The sources dive immediately into this psychological framework called nomophobia. And honestly, that sounds like a buzzword invented for a morning talk show.
It does sound like that.
Right. Is this an actual legitimate clinical designation?
It is increasingly being treated as one, yeah. Nomophobia is basically a portmanteau of no mobile phone phobia.
Okay. That makes sense.
Right. And it describes the severe, measurable anxiety, like the actual physiological stress response that an individual experiences when they're without their mobile device.
Or even just like disconnected from Wi-Fi.
Exactly. Even just losing cellular connectivity triggers it. And to understand how real this is, we really have to look at the global footprint.
You mean the data from the Middle East and South Korea?
Yeah. And Lebanon and Turkey. It's startling because these are vastly different cultures, different societal structures.
But the reaction is the same.
The psychological reaction to smartphone deprivation is practically identical across the board.
Wow. Let's look at that South Korean study specifically because the scale of it is just massive.
It really is. They tracked over 4,500 middle and high school students.
And the headline stat there is that roughly 7.5% of these kids were classified as legitimately clinically dependent on their smartphones.
Yes.
But how exactly are researchers measuring dependency here? Are they just asking teenagers like, hey, do you like your phone?
No. The methodology is much more rigorous than just self-reporting of preference. They utilize standardized psychometric evaluations.
Like what?
Well, there's the smartphone addiction scale, which measures very specific behavioral criteria. For instance, they look for tolerance.
Meaning they need more screen time to get the same baseline level of satisfaction?
Exactly. And they look for withdrawal too. Agitation, irritability, and even elevated cortisol levels when the device is removed.
But so real. Physical stress.
Real stress. They also measure the disruption of daily life. Things like failing grades, neglected physical hygiene.
Like hygiene.
Yeah, skipping showers, not brushing teeth, and the inability to stop using the device despite actively knowing it's causing harm.
And when they applied those rigorous metrics, they found that this dependency doesn't just exist in a vacuum, right?
Not at all.
Yeah.
It is deeply entwined with the deterioration of overall mental health.
Profoundly entwined. The South Korean data, which is mirrored perfectly by the university student data out of Lebanon, by the way, demonstrates that smartphone dependency correlates positively with significant spikes in depression.
Depression, anxiety, and perceived life stress. All of it spikes.
In fact, didn't the Lebanese study find that baseline depression and anxiety act as independent predictors of smartphone dependency?
Yes, they did. Meaning, if you are already anxious, you are highly likely to become dependent on the device. It's a pretty universal human reaction to seek a coping mechanism.
But the way people cope seems to split sharply along demographic lines.
It does.
The sources highlight that while younger users are universally more susceptible, which makes sense, I mean, they're digital natives who haven't known a world without ubiquitous connectivity, there is a stark difference in how men and women experience this.
Right. The underlying psychological drive is the exact same. It's that need for a dopamine release to soothe anxiety. But the vehicle changes.
How so?
Well, the studies indicate that male smartphone dependency is heavily anchored in gaming applications.
Oh, interesting.
Yet males are generally chasing the dopamine loop of achievement, spatial mastery, and virtual competition.
Whereas for females, the data shows the dependency is almost entirely linked to multimedia applications and social networks.
Exactly. It's a completely different flavor of the same addiction.
It leans heavily on social validation, right?
Social validation, interpersonal connection, and just the endless consumption of curated lifestyle media.
But regardless of whether the user is chasing a high score or like a high number of likes, the behavioral surveys reveal this fascinating dark side to the dependency.
They really do. It acts as a gateway or a compounding factor for other compulsive behaviors.
Yeah, individuals scoring high in smartphone dependency exhibit lower self-esteem, drastically reduced impulse control.
And statistically higher rates of smoking and alcohol consumption.
Hold on, I want to explore that connection. Because we usually think of scrolling on our phones as a way to unwind.
Right, that's the common perception.
Like, you have a brutal day at work, you collapse on the couch, and you just mindlessly scroll through a feed. It feels like you are relaxing.
It feels like it, yes.
But the data suggests it's actually tied to higher stress and lower impulse control. Why is that?
Well, to understand that paradox, we have to look at the metabolic cost of self-regulation. Your brain's executive functioning, the part of you that makes decisions, delays gratification, and regulates your emotions, it requires a massive amount of physical energy to operate.
So it's burning actual calories.
Yes. When you experience high levels of life stress, academic pressure, or professional anxiety, your cognitive reserves are severely depleted.
You literally don't have the energy to discipline yourself.
That is the biological reality. Self-control is metabolically expensive. So when stress bankrupts that energy budget, your brain defaults to the absolute path of least resistance.
To find a quick hit of dopamine.
Exactly. A quick hit that feels like relief. So you reach for the phone. And this triggers what researchers term cyberloafing.
Cyberloafing, I love that term.
It's very descriptive. It is that unstructured, aimless scrolling that feels almost trance-like.
But based on these studies, that scrolling doesn't actually replenish the energy budget at all. It's not actually relaxing.
Far from it. It compounds the exhaustion.
Yes.
Yes. The endless scrolling fragments your attention span. The rapid context switching required to process a new image or video every, 3 seconds. That burns through whatever residual cognitive energy you had left.
Wow.
Furthermore, the light emission from the screen and the constant microstimulations ruin your sleep architecture. You just don't hit deep, restorative REM sleep.
Which naturally leads to waking up chronically fatigued.
Right.
And what does chronic fatigue combined with fragmented attention lead to? More stress.
A massive spike in baseline stress, which further lowers your self-control.
Which prompts you to reach for the phone even earlier in the next day to cope.
It is a perfectly closed, self-sustaining behavioral loop.
Listening to you describe this, the analogy that comes to mind is that it's like drinking salt water when you're dying of thirst.
That is a very apt comparison.
You reach for the phone to self-medicate a feeling of being overwhelmed, but structurally, it acts as a cognitive stimulant.
It does. It spikes your heart rate, fragments your focus, and increases your baseline stress.
All while giving you this incredibly brief, hollow illusion that you are being comforted.
That is a highly accurate assessment of the psychological loop. You are applying a behavioral stimulant to treat a symptom of cognitive overstimulation.
Okay, so the software of the phone, the apps, and the feeds engineer the psychological loop that exhausts our cognitive reserves.
Correct.
But if we move to the next layer of the research, we see that the physical hardware of the device, the literal light it emits, is doing something arguably much worse to our actual cells.
This is where we transition from behavioral science into pediatric neurology and ophthalmology.
And the data here is incredibly sobering. Let's look at the longitudinal study out of Singapore.
Yes, the Singapore study. Researchers tracked 506 children from age 1 all the way to age 9.
That is a massive undertaking. Tracking a child from 12 months old until they are in the 4th grade,
Yeah.
that captures the absolute most explosive period of neuroplasticity in the human lifespan.
It really is the critical window.
How exactly did they measure the impact of screens on a brain that young?
They utilized a combination of continuous neurological monitoring, specifically utilizing EEGs at various developmental milestones.
Okay.
And they paired that with rigorous, standardized behavioral and cognitive assessments. They weren't just surveying parents about screen time.
They were looking at the actual hardware of the brain.
Exactly. They were looking at the literal electrical activity and gray matter development in the children's brains as it correlated with their screen exposure.
And what did they find?
They found that high screen time in early childhood leads to significant measurable deviations in brainwave activity, specifically pointing to profound deficits in the development of executive functions.
We touched on executive functions earlier regarding self-control, but let's define exactly what the Singapore researchers were testing for. What does a child lose when these functions are stunted?
Executive functions, which are housed primarily in the prefrontal cortex, are essentially the management system of the human brain. They encompass working memory, emotional regulation, the ability to follow multi-step instructions, and the capacity to inhibit impulses.
So if a child lacks executive functioning,
They cannot wait their turn, they cannot plan a task, and they cannot regulate a tantrum. It is the fundamental bedrock of social and academic success.
but let me challenge the premise here for a second. Why does a screen cause this?
It's a good question.
Like, if a kid is watching an educational cartoon, their brain is still processing information, right? Why does staring at an iPad disrupt the physical development of the prefrontal cortex?
It comes down to cognitive overload and resource allocation. The prefrontal cortex is a slow baking oven, It is one of the last areas of the brain to fully mature, continuing to develop well into a person's mid-20s.
Right, teenagers are notorious for bad impulse control.
Exactly. So when a toddler stares at a modern screen, they're being subjected to a highly engineered, relentlessly dynamic stream of sensory input.
Rapid scene shifts, flashing colors.
Hyperstimulating audio cues. Processing this level of visual and auditory chaos demands an enormous amount of raw computational power from the brain.
So the brain is basically running at maximum capacity just to decode the flashing lights.
That is exactly the mechanism. The brain is dedicating all of its metabolic energy and synaptic wiring to merely process the overwhelming sensory input.
And what's the trade-off?
In doing so, it literally starves the development of the higher order executive functions.
Oh, wow.
The neural pathways required for patience, for deep, sustained focus, and for quiet contemplation are completely deprived of the energy and the practice they need to wire together. The brain optimizes for processing rapid stimuli at the expense of deep thought.
It's like forcing a young athlete to run sprints on a treadmill at maximum speed all day and then wondering why they never developed the muscular endurance to run a marathon.
They just burn out.
But the brain isn't the only organ taking a direct hit from the screen. The research dives incredibly deep into the physical eye.
It does.
And there is a concept here that fundamentally shifted how I understand vision. The retina isn't just a camera lens. It is literally brain tissue pushed to the periphery.
Embryologically speaking, that is a biological fact.
That is mind-blowing.
It is. During fetal development, the retina, the incredibly complex light-sensitive layer at the back of your eye, grows out of the exact same neural tube that forms the brain and the spinal cord.
So it's part of the brain.
It is a direct extension of your central nervous system that sits exposed to the outside world. Its entire evolutionary purpose is to capture incoming photons of light and translate them into electrical impulses that the brain can read.
And the photons we are relentlessly feeding it from our screens are not natural. They are heavily skewed.
They are heavily concentrated in a very specific, highly aggressive wavelength. We are talking about HEV radiation high-energy visible light.
Blue light, right.
Specifically, yes. This is the blue light in the 415 to 455 nanometer range. Every smartphone, tablet, and computer monitor on the market utilizes LED and fluorescent backlighting.
Which blasts a radically higher concentration of this specific blue light compared to, say, natural sunlight or older incandescent bulbs.
Exactly.
But wait, humans evolved under the sun. The sun emits massive amounts of blue light. Why does the eye suddenly fail when it looks at a screen? Why doesn't it just adapt to the iPad the way it adapted to the sky?
That is the critical distinction right there. It's about the delivery mechanism and the intensity of the exposure.
Okay.
When you are outside, the blue light from the sun is ambient. It is scattered by the atmosphere, and you are rarely staring directly into the light source.
Right, you don't stare at the sun.
Furthermore, your pupil constricts, and you blink constantly. With a screen, you are holding a concentrated artificial light source mere inches from your face.
Staring directly into the beam.
Yes, and as the studies on computer vision syndrome show, your blink rate plummets by up to 60%.
You are just wide-eyed, absorbing a direct beam. And the sources point out that this specific HEV radiation penetrates deeper into the eye than UVA and UVB rays.
It does. UV rays are mostly absorbed by the cornea and the lens at the front of the eye. But HEV blue light punches straight through to the back of the eye.
Directly striking the retina.
And when this high-energy light hits the retinal tissue, it triggers violent photochemical reactions.
The sources mention the creation of free radicals and oxidative stress. Break that down for us. What is a free radical actually doing to the eye?
Imagine a microscopic wrecking ball. A free radical is an atom or molecule that is missing an electron, making it highly unstable.
Okay, so it wants to stabilize itself.
Exactly. To stabilize itself, it violently rips an electron away from the nearest healthy cell. When HEV light bombards the retina, it generates a massive surplus of these free radicals.
And they just start attacking the eye.
They begin tearing electrons from the photoreceptor cells and the retinal pigment epithelium. This creates a chain reaction of cellular destruction known as oxidative stress.
Wow.
Over time, this literally kills the cells of the macula, which is the central part of the retina responsible for our sharpest, highest resolution vision.
It is slowly burning a hole in the highest definition part of our vision.
That's essentially what is happening, yes.
And age is a massive, terrifying factor here. The research states that children are at a drastically higher risk for this specific retinal damage than adults. Why is that?
It revolves around the crystalline lens. That's the biological magnifying glass located just behind the pupil.
Okay.
In a 10 to 12-year-old child, that crystalline lens is incredibly pristine. It is practically transparent.
Like a brand new window.
Exactly. As a human ages, exposure to the elements naturally causes that lens to yellow and cloud slightly. This yellowing actually acts as a built-in biological filter, absorbing some of the blue light.
But because a child's lens is perfectly clear.
It provides zero filtration.
So a child staring at a tablet is essentially taking the absolute full, unfiltered blast of HEV radiation directly to their macular tissue.
Yes. The child's retina receives up to 10 times more blue light radiation than the retina of an elderly person looking at the exact same screen.
10 times? That is horrible.
And the damage doesn't stop at the cellular level. The mechanics of the eye are failing too.
What do you mean?
Well, the constant need to focus on a fixed hypernear distance, like a phone held 6 inches from the face, causes severe prolonged spasms in the ciliary muscles of the eye.
Oh, because they're strained from looking at something so close.
Right. This is driving the unprecedented, explosive global epidemic of acquired myopia, or nearsightedness, in youths. The eyeball is literally elongating to adapt to a world that only exists 6 inches away.
The eyeball is changing its physical shape.
It is.
The sources also detail a bizarre physiological glitch called night myopia. How does staring at a screen ruin your ability to see in the dark?
It's a fascinating adaptation failure. Researchers have discovered that when we stare into the bright artificial light of a device for hours, the muscles controlling our pupils adapt to that specific static environment.
Okay, so they get used to the bright screen.
They learn to constrict very efficiently to block the glare. However, they lose their elasticity. They lose the ability to dilate rapidly.
Oh, I see.
So after a 3-hour scrolling session, if you turn off your phone and step into a dimly lit hallway, your pupils lag. They refuse to open up enough to let the ambient light in.
Causing a temporary inability to see in the dark.
Or focus on distant objects, yeah. You have mechanically trained your eyes to fail in the real world.
So we have a device that removes all friction from the dopamine loop, exhausting our cognitive reserves, while simultaneously utilizing high-energy light to starve the prefrontal cortex of executive function development and chemically burn our retinal tissue.
It is a masterclass in modern engineering, overriding ancient biology.
Which provides the perfect, albeit grim, transition because there is another modern handheld device doing the exact same thing.
Yes, there is.
It swaps the digital friction of a screen for the chemical friction of an aerosol, We need to dissect the electronic vaporizer.
This is a sector where the gap between public perception and chemical reality is dangerously wide. The narrative surrounding vapes is entirely manufactured.
Let's bypass the basic anatomy of a vape. I mean, everyone knows it's a battery, a heating coil, and a tank of liquid.
Right.
The lie that the manufacturers have successfully sold the public is that these devices are a clean, medical-grade, Silicon Valley alternative to the dirty, tar-filled reality of combustible cigarettes.
Yes, that was the original pitch.
They want you to believe you are inhaling a futuristic cloud of harmless water vapor spiked with a clean dose of pharmaceutical nicotine.
And as the toxicological reports in our stack make abundantly clear, water vapor is the absolute last thing you are inhaling.
What is it then?
You are inhaling a highly volatile, thermally degraded chemical aerosol. But to truly understand the danger, we have to start at the source of the addiction.
The nicotine itself.
Exactly. The supply chain data, particularly the deep dive into Russian customs declarations, reveals a horrifying economic reality about how this nicotine is produced.
I want to spend time on this because the extraction methods are wild. It's a tale of two entirely different chemicals. Break down the high-end versus the low-end extraction for us.
Sure. On the high end, you have chemically pure nicotine. This is extracted using advanced multi-stage fractionation columns.
So fancy lab equipment.
Very fancy. It is a meticulous laboratory-grade process that strips away all impurities, leaving a highly refined product. However, this process is astronomically expensive.
How expensive are we talking?
Pure nicotine costs roughly $2,000 per kilogram on the global market, and it is primarily synthesized in countries with strict chemical manufacturing regulations, like Germany, the United States, and the Netherlands.
But the customs data shows that the vast majority of the liquids flooding the market, like the cheap, disposable vapes sold at every corner store, are absolutely not using this $2,000 a kilo pure nicotine.
They aren't.
The profit margins on a $10 disposable vape simply do not allow for it.
They don't. The market demands cheap nicotine. And to get cheap nicotine, manufacturers turn to a brutal, primitive extraction process known as sulfation.
Walk us through sulfation. What does this look like in reality?
It looks like an industrial waste process. Manufacturers take the absolute lowest grade of tobacco refuse. The stems, the floor sweepings, the moldy crumbs that cannot be sold as rolling tobacco.
The literal garbage.
The garbage, yes. And they dump it into vats. They then treat this refuse with industrial sulfuric acid.
Sulfuric acid.
Yes, the acid violently strips the nicotine out of the plant matter, creating a compound called nicotine sulfate. This sludge is then dissolved in water, coarsely filtered, and evaporated.
And the cost difference is staggering, right?
It drops from $2,000 a kilogram down to roughly $20 a kilogram.
Unbelievable.
It is a massive economic incentive to use the dirty process, but the chemical output is horrifying. The nicotine sulfate produced by this method is so dense with toxic impurities that from a chemical classification standpoint, it is categorized alongside agricultural insecticides.
Wait, really? Insecticides?
Yes, the sources explicitly note that the toxicity profile matches commercial pesticides like Stozar and Actara.
What are those used for?
They are used by farmers to nerve gas crop parasites.
Okay, so a user is literally inhaling agricultural-grade poison. That is bad enough. But the sources detail how these specific impurities engineer something far more insidious. They call it the alkaloid trap.
The alkaloid trap is the key to the whole dependency model.
Let's look at the mechanics of this trap, because this explains why vaping is so incredibly hard to quit. What happens in the bloodstream when you inhale this cheap, sulfated sludge?
When you inhale nicotine, your biology immediately recognizes it as a neurotoxin. In response, your liver produces an enzyme called cholinesterase.
Cholinesterase.
Cholinesterase is basically a biological cleanup crew. It rushes into the bloodstream, binds to the nicotine, and dismantles it.
It breaks it down.
It is highly efficient, destroying the nicotine in your system in about 30 to 40 minutes.
Which perfectly explains the behavioral loop. 30 minutes go by, the nicotine is destroyed, the brain feels the deficit, and the user reaches for the vape to take another puff.
Precisely. But here is the mechanism of the trap. Cholinesterase is highly specialized. It only targets the nicotine molecule. It completely ignores the dozens of other toxic tobacco alkaloids that were carried over by the dirty sulfation process.
Wait, so the enzyme destroys the nicotine but leaves the toxic impurities floating in the blood?
Exactly. Those secondary alkaloids are not cleared out. They metabolize at a much slower rate.
So they just build up?
Yes. So the user takes a puff at 8:00 a.m. By 8:30 a.m., the nicotine is gone, but the impurities remain. The user takes another puff. Now they have a fresh dose of nicotine and a double dose of impurities. By noon, they have puffed a dozen times. By 8:00 p.m., they have built up a massive compounding reservoir of these secondary tobacco alkaloids in their cardiovascular system.
It's like paying off a credit card but ignoring the compound interest. The nicotine is the principal that your body pays off every 30 minutes, but the other alkaloids are the interest quietly bankrupting your system.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it.
By the end of the day, the sheer volume of these impurities vastly outweighs the actual nicotine you're chasing.
Exactly. The user thinks they are addicted to the nicotine, but by the evening, their body is actually fighting a severe, complex chemical dependency on a half dozen different industrial alkaloids.
Which locks them in.
It locks them into a systemic toxicity that is exponentially harder to detox from than pure nicotine.
And yet, it gets worse.
Yeah.
Because the industry didn't just stop at cheap, dirty nicotine. They fundamentally altered the pH of the chemical to bypass the body's natural defenses.
The invention of nicotine salts.
Yes. We have to talk about salt nicotine versus free-base nicotine and the University of Louisville study on mice. What is the difference between these two formulations?
For the first decade of the vaping industry, the standard was free-base nicotine. This is an alkaline formulation very similar to the chemical state of nicotine in a burning cigarette.
Okay.
Because it is highly alkaline, it produces a harsh burning sensation in the back of the throat when inhaled.
The throat hit, which acts as a biological speed limit, essentially. If you inhale too deeply or hit the vape too many times in a row, it physically hurts. Your body forces you to stop.
Correct. It is a natural deterrent against acute nicotine poisoning. But the industry wanted to increase the dose and frequency, so they created nicotine salts.
How did they do that?
By adding an acid to the mixture, usually benzoic acid, they drastically lowered the pH level of the liquid. This neutralized the alkalinity, making the vapor incredibly smooth.
They removed the biological friction. Now you can inhale massive, hyper-concentrated clouds of nicotine deep into the lungs without feeling a tickle.
Exactly. And the University of Louisville study exposes the physiological terror of this invention.
What did they find?
They tested animal models, exposing mice to 1%, 2.5%, and 5% nicotine aerosol concentrations. They found that because salt nicotine has a modified pH and lacks the throat hit, it absorbs across the delicate lung tissue and into the arterial bloodstream at an incredibly violent speed.
Far faster than free-base nicotine.
Much faster.
And what does that rapid spike in blood nicotine do to the heart?
It causes immediate cardiovascular trauma. The study documented severe cardiac arrhythmias, irregular chaotic heartbeats.
Wow.
To understand why, we have to look at the sympathetic nervous system.
The fight-or-flight response.
Yes. The sympathetic nervous system controls your heart rate, blood pressure, and vascular constriction in response to danger. The rapid, massive influx of salt nicotine directly binds to and hyperstimulates specific beta receptors in the heart.
Let me stop you there because there's a paradox here. People vape to calm down. I see people hit a vape and physically sigh in relief.
Right.
If nicotine is a stimulant that triggers a fight-or-flight response, why does it feel relaxing?
That is the grand physiological illusion of addiction. The chemical itself is a stimulant. It is actively spiking your heart rate and raising your blood pressure.
But the user feels relaxed.
Because the act of satisfying the withdrawal craving, combined with the deep diaphragmatic breathing required to inhale the vapor, tricks the brain into perceiving relaxation.
So it's a trick.
Yes. You are biologically in a state of panic, but neurologically you feel relieved because you fed the craving.
That is terrifying.
And the strain on the heart is immense. The salt nicotine is triggering the exact same beta receptors in the heart that cardiologists actively try to suppress using beta blocker medications in patients with heart failure.
Wait, really?
Yes. A vapor is voluntarily administering a chemical that forces their heart muscle to race, misfire, and spasm.
But surely this is still better than smoking a regular cigarette. The Kalashnikov dissertation we reviewed did some head-to-head comparisons.
Dr. Kalashnikov's research provides vital nuance here. When looking at heated tobacco products, devices that bake actual tobacco leaves without setting them on fire, the data shows a legitimate harm reduction in a specific area.
Which area?
Heated tobacco reduces the intake of tobacco-specific nitrosamines, which are highly carcinogenic compounds, by 92 to 97% compared to combustible cigarettes.
Okay, so baking tobacco is less toxic than burning it. But what about NDS, electronic nicotine delivery systems, the liquid vapes?
The toxicity of liquid vapes proved to be highly volatile, heavily dependent on the mechanical stability of the device itself.
Give us an example.
Kalashnikov tested a specific, popular device, the IQ I-200. During standard operational testing, the device's microchip failed to regulate the power output, causing the heating coil to overheat.
And what happens when it overheats?
When the metal coil gets too hot, it thermally degrades the base liquids in the cartridge. The result was a catastrophic chemical breakdown, releasing massive, highly toxic plumes of formaldehyde and acrolein into the vapor.
So if the 50-cent microchip in your disposable plastic vape decides to glitch,
Which happens frequently.
the device instantly transforms from a nicotine delivery system into a chemical weapons factory, pumping embalming fluid into your lungs.
That is the acute mechanical risk, yes. But the chronic risk lies in what makes up 99% of that liquid.
The flavors.
Yes, we need to look past the nicotine and examine the flavorings, because this is where the damage moves from the heart directly into the actual tissue of the lungs.
The flavorings are the bait. It's what brings the youth demographic in. We are talking about thousands of synthetic profiles. Cotton candy, blue raspberry, vanilla custard.
All of them.
The in vitro studies out of San Diego and Adelaide tested this specific threat. They took 10 popular e-liquid flavors and exposed human respiratory cells to them in a petri dish. What happened?
Total cellular devastation. They found that every single flavor tested was toxic to human cells to varying degrees, entirely independent of whether nicotine was present.
So the flavor itself is the poison?
The flavoring chemicals themselves were the poison, and certain profiles were markedly worse. Synthetic chemicals designed to mimic the taste of chocolate, banana, vanilla, and cinnamon were identified as inducing the highest rates of cellular death in respiratory tissue.
And these flavors aren't just floating in the air, they are suspended in base liquids. Let's break down PG and VG because these acronyms are on every bottle of vape juice in the world.
Okay, PG stands for propylene glycol. It is a synthetic organic compound synthesized from propylene oxide, which is a byproduct of the petrochemical industry.
Petrochemicals. Great.
It is an incredibly effective solvent, widely used industrially. In fact, it is a primary component in antifreeze used for internal combustion engines because it lowers the freezing point of water.
And VG.
VG stands for vegetable glycerin. It was discovered in 1779 and is a thick, sweet, viscous liquid extracted from plant oils. It is heavily used in the cosmetics industry to make soaps and lotions.
Okay, so you take industrial antifreeze solvent, mix it with cosmetic soap base, inject synthetic banana flavoring, and then drag it across a 400-degree metal coil. What is the chemical output of that thermal event?
The thermal degradation of PG and VG creates a highly toxic aerosol profile, primarily generating acrolein and formaldehyde.
We mentioned those earlier.
Right. Acrolein is a severe, violent irritant. When it hits the respiratory tract, it causes immediate tearing of the eyes and triggers the body to produce massive amounts of mucus in the larynx, trachea, and nasal passages.
In a desperate attempt to flush the chemical out.
The body is literally trying to drown the chemical in mucus to protect the tissue.
And the formaldehyde.
Formaldehyde is even more insidious. It bypasses the localized irritation and impacts the central nervous system, causing excitability, severe muscle spasms, and at high enough concentrations, respiratory paralysis and coma.
This precise chemical alchemy, mixing thickeners and flavors and dragging them over heat, is exactly what triggered the massive public health crisis in the United States in 2019, the EVALI epidemic.
Yes. EVALI stands for e-cigarette or vaping product use-associated lung injury. It was a terrifying epidemiological event that peaked in late 2019.
It was primarily striking down healthy youths under the age of 20, wasn't it?
It was. Hospitals across the country were flooded with thousands of cases, resulting in dozens of fatalities. These young patients were presenting in emergency rooms with profound shortness of breath, agonizing chest pain, high fevers, and severe gastrointestinal distress like nausea and diarrhea.
The chest x-rays were described as looking like a bomb went off in the lungs, severe bilateral pneumonia.
The radiological imaging was horrific. It showed dense, rounded opacities spreading across the lower lobes of both lungs. This is indicative of acute respiratory distress syndrome,
The lung tissue was entirely inflamed.
reacting to a massive, unrecognized foreign body invasion.
And the CDC eventually traced the mechanics of this invasion back to black market THC cartridges, right? Specifically to a chemical called vitamin E acetate.
Yes.
Why were they putting vitamins in a vape?
They weren't adding it for health benefits, I can tell you that. Vitamin E acetate is a thick, viscous, oily substance. Black market manufacturers realized it was the exact same color and consistency as THC oil.
Oh, so they used it as a cheap cutting agent.
Exactly. To dilute the expensive THC, allowing them to stretch their product and increase profits. The catastrophic error was a failure to understand chemistry.
Right.
When you ingest vitamin E as a supplement, it is perfectly safe. But when you apply intense thermal heat to vitamin E acetate, it undergoes a molecular fracture, transforming into a highly reactive, highly caustic compound called ketene.
But it wasn't just the ketone burning the lungs. The physical properties of the vaporized oil were causing a mechanical failure in the respiratory system.
This is the crux of the issue. The human lung is an organ evolved over millions of years to process atmospheric gases. Oxygen in, carbon dioxide out.
Right, it's a gas exchange organ.
It is absolutely not designed to process aerosolized lipids or oils. When a user inhales a vaporized cloud of vitamin E acetate, or even heavily concentrated essential flavoring oils, that vapor is extremely hot
But then it travels down the trachea.
and enters the expansive, moist, cooler environment of the deep lung tissue. Thermodynamics takes over. The vapor cools rapidly.
And it condenses.
It condenses back into its original physical state. The vapor turns back into microscopic droplets of oil, which settle deep inside the alveoli, the tiny air sacs where gas exchange occurs.
And how does the body react to that?
The body's immune system recognizes this coating of oil as a massive, lethal, foreign invader. It mounts an overwhelming inflammatory response, sending white blood cells to attack the oil.
Which causes the pneumonia.
The result is lipoid pneumonia. The lungs literally fill with fluid and immune cells in a desperate attempt to clear the fat, essentially drowning the patient from the inside out.
The sources also bring up another terrifying permanent lung condition linked to flavorings. Popcorn lung.
The clinical designation is bronchiolitis obliterans. This pathology is inextricably linked to a specific, highly popular flavoring chemical called diacetyl.
What does diacetyl taste like?
It is engineered to provide a rich, creamy, buttery flavor profile. It's often used in dessert vapes, and surprisingly, as a smoothing agent in menthol profiles.
Why is it called popcorn lung, though?
It earned that moniker because it was first identified as an occupational hazard in factory workers at microwave popcorn plants. These workers were breathing in the ambient dust of the artificial butter flavoring all day.
And what did it do to them?
The diacetyl causes aggressive, irreversible scarring and severe narrowing of the bronchioles, which are the absolute smallest, most delicate airways in the lungs. It is incurable and often requires a full lung transplant.
This brings up a massive, dangerous cognitive dissonance that the public falls victim to. A teenager looks at a bottle of vape juice. It says vanilla custard. It says FDA-approved food-grade flavoring. The logical leap is, well, if it's FDA approved for me to eat it, it must be safe for me to vape it.
Which is incredibly dangerous.
Why is food grade completely irrelevant when it comes to the lungs?
It is a fundamental, fatal misunderstanding of human anatomy. Your digestive tract is a fortress. It is one of the most robust, highly defended, chemically aggressive systems in your entire body.
Okay.
If you eat a gummy bear flavored with synthetic diacetyl and propylene glycol, it travels down a thick esophagus into your stomach, which is literally a biological vat of highly concentrated hydrochloric acid.
The chemicals are pulverized.
Pulverized by the acid, aggressively metabolized and filtered by the liver, and safely excreted. The stomach is an armored tank designed to destroy foreign matter.
Right, but the lungs are the exact opposite.
The lungs are a delicate, porous sponge. The alveoli in your lungs are microscopic membranes that are only a single cell thick.
They have to be that thin to let oxygen through.
Exactly. They have to allow oxygen molecules to pass instantly into the bloodstream.
Yeah.
They have no protective mucus barrier like the stomach. They have no acid. They have no armor.
So when you inhale that same synthetic vanilla custard flavor,
You are bypassing all of the body's primary defenses and painting a raw, naked, single-cell thick membrane with complex, thermally degraded industrial chemicals.
and the research highlights a very specific microscopic casualty of this exposure, the alveolar macrophages.
Ah, yes. The microscopic Roombas.
That is exactly what they are. Alveolar macrophages are specialized immune cells that constantly patrol the moist inner surfaces of your lungs. They act like autonomous vacuum cleaners, seeking out and gobbling up ambient dust, dead cells, and invading bacteria.
They are your lungs' frontline infantry.
Right, and the in vitro studies demonstrate that when these macrophages are exposed to the chemical aerosol of vape flavorings, their cellular viability absolutely plummets.
It does.
They die.
Worse, they become paralyzed. They literally lose their motility, their ability to migrate across the lung tissue, and they lose their phagocytic function.
Which is their ability to consume and destroy bacteria.
Yes. By inhaling synthetic flavors, you are chemically suffocating and paralyzing the immune cells that keep your lungs from rotting from bacterial infection.
It's like assuming that because a high-end perfume smells exactly like real lavender, you can just pour it into a glass and drink it.
Right.
Just because a synthetic chocolate flavor is safe to be pulverized by your stomach acid doesn't mean it won't literally paralyze the immune system inside your lungs.
It is an entirely different route of exposure, governed by entirely different biological rules, with entirely different, often catastrophic consequences.
So with all this invisible damage occurring, from the salt nicotine-inducing cardiac arrhythmias to the diacetyl scarring the bronchioles and the HEV light from our screens burning our maculas, how is society actually responding?
It's a huge question.
And what happens when an individual realizes they are trapped in this loop and tries to break free?
The societal and medical response is finally shifting, but it is fighting a deeply entrenched, highly engineered behavioral and chemical addiction. First and foremost, the medical community is actively dismantling the foundational myth of the vaping industry.
That these devices function as a smoking cessation tool.
Right. The original sales pitch was that you buy a vape to step down your nicotine intake and eventually quit smoking combustible cigarettes altogether.
But that's not what's happening.
In a strictly controlled, highly monitored clinical setting, utilizing pure, unflavored nicotine, there is a narrow use case for harm reduction. But in the wild, unregulated reality of the consumer market, the data shows the exact opposite is occurring.
Vaping is not replacing smoking. It is compounding it.
The psychological studies highlight the rise of a new demographic: the square smokers.
Square smokers, what is that?
Square smokers are individuals who attempt to use a vape to quit cigarettes but fail. Instead of replacing the habit, they develop a dual overlapping dependency. They smoke combustible cigarettes when they are outside or in an environment that permits it to get that specific freebase nicotine and tar profile they crave. And then, when they go to work or sit in their living room or lie in bed, they hit their salt nicotine vape.
They have essentially ensured that their body is never, ever without a massive influx of nicotine.
Exactly.
And the data regarding the youth demographic is staggering. We aren't just looking at adult smokers trying to quit. We are looking at a virgin demographic being onboarded into addiction. The sources point to regional data from Khabarovsk. What did they find there?
The Khabarovsk data is a terrifying snapshot of a cultural contagion. They surveyed students from the 5th to the 11th grade. In 2021, the baseline usage rate of vapes among these children was 13.35%.
Okay, that's already high.
But just one single year later, in 2022, that number violently leaped to 21.4%.
Wow, in 1 year.
Yes, and crucially, over 81% of those children reported that their close friends or family members smoke or vape. It spreads through social proximity like a virus.
And once that dependency takes hold in a young brain, the addiction cycle is brutal. Because the salt nicotine spikes so fast and the cholinesterase clears it so quickly, and because the device is constantly in their pocket, the interval between puffs shrinks drastically.
The interval compression is severe. Unlike a cigarette smoker who might go 3 or 4 hours between smoke breaks, the modern vapor finds themselves physically requiring a hit every 1 to 2 hours. Often, it is a continuous subconscious behavior.
And if you take the device away, what does the withdrawal actually look like biologically?
The withdrawal syndrome is fierce and multisystemic because the body is detoxing not just from nicotine but from the accumulated reservoir of secondary alkaloids. The user experiences crushing anxiety,
And heightened irritability.
explosive irritability, an uncontrollable obsessive urge to smoke, severe difficulty focusing on basic tasks, physical tension, headaches, and a profound, insatiable increase in appetite as the body searches for any alternative dopamine source.
It is not just a bad habit. It's not like biting your nails. The medical community treats this as a serious pathology.
Absolutely. In the global medical literature, this specific level of chemical dependency is officially coded under the ICD-10, the International Classification of Diseases, as F12.2.
F12.2.
That designates a psychiatric syndrome of dependence. You cannot just willpower your way out of it.
What does treatment even look like?
Treating an F12.2 diagnosis requires specialized narcologists, psychotherapists, physical medical detox to clear the accumulated heavy metals and resin toxins from the liver and lungs, and intensive cognitive behavioral intervention to physically rewire the habit loop in the basal ganglia.
It is a full-scale medical emergency.
It is. And because the medical reality is so dire, we are seeing massive global pushback from legislators. It's not just strongly worded Surgeon General warnings on the side of a box anymore. Governments are waking up to the biological threat.
What are they doing?
They're resorting to strict, uncompromising punitive measures. The UK has launched massive, heavily funded campaigns specifically targeting youth vaping. But you look at countries across South America and Asia, Argentina, Brazil, Cambodia, Turkey, they haven't just regulated them, they have instituted sweeping, total bans on the manufacture, sale, and use of these devices.
The sources mentioned Thailand. Their approach is incredibly aggressive.
Very aggressive.
It is so strictly enforced that police will actively search tourists' bags at the airport for hidden vapes, and they routinely set up checkpoints to stop taxis at night, specifically to look for passengers vaping.
Yes, and if you get caught, you face severe financial ruin or potential jail time.
And Singapore takes the punitive model to its absolute logical extreme. Not only do importers and sellers face immediate guaranteed prison time, but the fines directed at the end user are astronomical.
They are.
If you take a single puff of an electronic cigarette in a public space in Singapore, you are hit with an immediate $1,500 fine.
$1,500 for one inhale. That shows you exactly how seriously public health officials are taking the epidemiological threat. They view it as a biohazard.
They are reacting to the incredibly unique, insidious nature of this specific addiction. And this brings us full circle to the very beginning of our conversation.
It does.
Consider the mechanics of a traditional combustible cigarette. To smoke, you have to find a lighter, you have to physically step outside into the weather, you have to light the paper on fire, and you have to commit to 5 uninterrupted minutes of inhaling harsh, foul-smelling smoke.
It is an activity loaded with natural friction.
But a vape has zero friction. It doesn't smell. It doesn't require a lighter. You can hit it continuously, indoors, lying in bed secretly in a classroom without ever breaking your focus.
It perfectly mirrors the smartphone addiction loop we mapped out in the first section.
That is the ultimate unifying thread here.
It is the exact same behavioral paradigm.
Yeah.
The smartphone provides a constant, frictionless, easily accessible, endlessly scrolling dopamine hit that ultimately exhausts your cognitive resources and starves your prefrontal cortex.
While the vaporizer provides a constant, frictionless, easily accessible, sweet-tasting chemical hit that ultimately exhausts your cardiovascular system and paralyzes your pulmonary immune cells.
Both devices rely entirely on removing the natural friction of the real world to violently accelerate a biological loop.
We've covered a staggering amount of ground today, from the psychological trap of nomophobia and the destruction of our executive functions to the HEV radiation burning our maculas.
Down into the dirt floor vats of sulfuric acid extracting pesticide-grade nicotine.
And the cardiac arrhythmias caused by manipulated pH levels, and finally to the synthetic flavors literally paralyzing the immune system inside our lungs.
A lot to process.
What is the overarching takeaway here? Like, what is the true cost for a user who picked up a vape thinking it was a healthy, modern off-ramp from smoking, or a teenager who thought a smartphone was just a tool for connection, only to find themselves trapped in heavily engineered, invisible dependencies?
The ultimate cost is the loss of your biological autonomy.
Your biological autonomy.
Yes. Without realizing it, you have surrendered the pacing of your own neurochemistry, the structural integrity of your eyes, and the cellular defense mechanisms of your cardiovascular and respiratory systems. You're handing them over to the design parameters of a mass-produced consumer product.
If we pull back and look at the whole picture, it reveals a very clear, if slightly intimidating, narrative. Both the glowing glass screens we stare into and the sleek metal tubes we inhale from are undeniable triumphs of modern engineering. They are frictionless, they are intuitive, and they are ruthlessly effective at what they were designed to do.
But they are hacking ancient biological hardware.
Hardware that isn't ready for it.
Exactly. Our biology has simply not had the millions of years required to evolve defenses against our own technology. Yeah. Our eyes were absolutely not built to absorb constant, directed, unblinking, high-energy blue radiation from 6 inches away.
And our prefrontal cortex was not meant to process infinite, flashing, fragmented dopamine loops while being starved of the energy needed for executive function development.
And our delicate single-cell alveolar membranes definitely did not evolve to process vaporized engine antifreeze, agricultural alkaloids, and synthetic thermally degraded banana oil.
So to you listening right now, the goal of this deep dive isn't to make you throw your phone into the nearest river or to spiral into a state of panic about navigating the modern world.
No, the goal is empowerment.
Right. The goal is to help you cultivate a deep, radically informed awareness of the physical-chemical relationship you have with your technology. Because when it comes to the invisible forces shaping our health, deep mechanistic knowledge is your absolute best biological defense.
When you understand the actual mechanisms, when you see the alkaloid trap for what it is, when you understand the oxidative stress in your retina, the illusion breaks. You reclaim your control.
Which leaves us with one final lingering thought to explore. Throughout this deep dive, we've focused on the things we hold directly in our hands, but we've seen how profoundly structurally reactive our bodies are to the most minute details.
The specific nanometer frequency of a blue light pixel.
The exact pH level of engineered nicotine salts, the thermal breakdown of a cosmetic soap base. So, if our cellular biology is this incredibly vulnerable to the tools we think we control, what other unseen microscopic interactions with our daily modern environment are subtly rewriting human biology right now while we just happily scroll and puff the days away?